Clara Whitmore did not ask permission. She did not knock. She did not call out. She did not wait to be invited. She pulled back the canvas flap of a stranger's wagon, with both hands shaking, threw herself between two sacks of flour, and pressed her face into the rough burlap, and prayed to God the man who owned this wagon was not the kind who turned women over to the men hunting them. She could hear the horses already. They were close. If this story already has your heart pounding, subscribe to this channel right now, hit that notification bell, and follow every single part of Clara's journey to the very end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that wagon. Because what happens in the next 60 seconds is going to change 2 lives forever. Nathan Cole had not spoken more than 30 words to another human being in 11 days. He had counted not because he was lonely, but because counting things was how he kept himself from thinking about the things that had no answers. 11 days since the supply run before this one. 11 days of fence posts and feed bags, and the particular silence of high Colorado in October, when the aspens had gone gold, and the wind came down off the peaks like something with a grudge. He had been perfectly content. He would have told anyone that, if anyone had asked, which they hadn't because nobody came up his mountain anymore, and that was precisely how he preferred it. He'd loaded his wagon before dawn, made the ride into Silver Creek, by mid-morning, worked through his list the way a man works through a list when he has no interest in dawdling flour, salt lamp oil, cartridges, 2 rolls of wire, a tin of camphor salve, and a bottle of willow bark extract for the headaches that came when the cold air dropped fast. He had nodded at the men he recognized. He had said yes ma'am and no ma'am to the women behind the counter at Gunderson's. He had declined the offer of a whiskey from Tom Haller at the saloon, not because he didn't drink, but because drinking in town led to talking, and talking led to the kind of slow entanglement he had no patience for anymore. He'd had that life once. He didn't anymore. His wife Ruth had been dead 4 years. His brother Daniel gone 18 months after her, both of them taken by the same fever that had swept through the lower valley in the summer of 1885, like a fire through dry grass. Nathan had buried them both on the south slope of his property, where the morning light came in long and golden, because Ruth had loved mornings and Daniel had loved gold. He hadn't cried at either funeral, not because he didn't feel it, but because by the time Daniel went, Nathan had already used up everything soft inside himself just trying to keep going. He'd sold his house in town 6 months after Daniel's burial. Moved up the mountain permanently. Told himself he was doing it for the land. Told himself the higher elevation was better for the horses he was breeding, which was true. Told himself a lot of things that were partially true and didn't examine the rest too closely. He was tying the last of his supplies into the wagon bed, double knotting the rope the way a man does when he's thinking about other things when he heard it. Not a voice. Not a footstep. Something smaller. A shift in the canvas. The particular sound of weight settling into something it wasn't meant to settle into. One long, controlled exhale, the kind a person takes when they're trying very hard not to make a sound and the effort is starting to cost them. Nathan's hands stilled on the rope. He stood there for a moment. Just stood there, listening to Silver Creek going about its ordinary noon business around him. The blacksmith's hammer, 2 women talking outside the milliner's, a dog barking at something down by the livery. Everything normal. Everything unremarkable. Except for that sound inside his wagon. He did not reach for his rifle. He did not call out. He walked around to the back of the wagon, took hold of the canvas edge with one hand, and pulled it aside. The woman inside looked up at him. She was young mid-20s, he guessed, and she was pressed into the narrow space between his flour sacks and his tool crate, with the particular stillness of someone who has learned recently and painfully that stillness is survival. Her hair was dark brown and had come half loose from whatever she'd pinned it with, curling against her cheek and her neck. Her face was round, her skin flushed from heat and fear. Her hands, both of them white-knuckled, locked around the strap of a small cloth bag she held against her chest, like it was the last solid thing in the world. She was wearing a blue dress that had seen better days, and she was not small. She was full-figured, the kind of woman who took up real space in the world. And there was something almost surreal about the way she'd folded herself into that narrow gap, like she could make herself disappear by sheer will. But it was her eyes that stopped him. Brown. Wide. Terrified, yes, but not in the way of someone broken. In the way of someone who has been fighting for a long time, and is desperately, desperately tired, and is asking one more thing of themselves before they rest. That was what he noticed. Not her size. Not the disheveled hair, or the dirty hem, or the white knuckles. Her eyes. The particular quality in them that said, "I am not done yet." Nathan opened his mouth. And that was when the horses came. 3 of them coming up the main street at a trot that wasn't quite urgent, but wasn't casual either, the specific pace of men who are looking for something and expect to find it. Nathan heard them before he saw them, and he saw the woman in his wagon hear them too, because every muscle in her body went rigid and her gaze snapped to a point just past his shoulder. "Please." Her voice was barely above a breath. Her eyes came back to his, and in them was everything, the whole desperate arithmetic of her situation, laid out in a single word, and 2 open, honest, terrified eyes. "Please. Tell them I'm your wife. Just until we're out of town, please." Nathan had approximately 4 seconds to make a decision. He'd made faster ones. He let the canvas drop. He walked back around to the front of the wagon, stepped up onto the bench, gathered the reins in both hands, and waited. The 3 riders pulled up alongside him. The one in front was broad-shouldered with a sheriff's deputy badge on his vest that Nathan recognized as belonging to a man named Garrett Walsh, not a lawman by conviction, but by employment, which was an entirely different thing. The other 2 he didn't know by name, but he knew the type. Men who did other men's errands and didn't examine the nature of those errands too closely. Cole, Walsh said. He'd dropped the mister, which told Nathan something about who was doing the asking. "You see a woman come through here, brown hair, blue dress, heavy-set. She'd have been moving quick." Nathan looked at him the way a man looks at something that does not particularly interest him. "My wife's in the back," he said. "Been buying ribbon or some such. We're heading home." Walsh leaned slightly in his saddle, trying to get a sight line around the wagon. "Mind if I take a look?" "I do, actually." Nathan's voice was flat and perfectly conversational. "She's been feeling poorly since morning. Stomach trouble. You want to explain to her why you're pulling back her privacy on a public street, that's your business. But she's not going to thank you for it, and neither am I." There was a pause. Walsh exchanged a look with one of the other men, and that was when Clara saved herself. The canvas shifted. She came out from under it, not quickly, not frantically, but with the composed and slightly irritated expression of a woman who has been napping in an uncomfortable wagon and has been woken up by her husband's inability to simply handle things. She pressed one hand to her temple. She squinted at the sun like it had personally offended her. "Nathan," she said, and her voice was steadier than Nathan would have managed in her position. "Are we going, or aren't we?" It was extraordinary. It wasn't the words were nothing, barely anything at all. It was the tone. The precise note of wifely exasperation that contained within it an entire history of shared mornings and small frustrations, and the complete, unquestioned assumption that this man and this woman belonged in the same wagon going in the same direction. Walsh's eyes moved over her. Nathan watched him do the math. Her size, her flushed face, the slightly disheveled look of a woman who'd been sleeping badly in a moving wagon. Nothing about it said fugitive. Everything about it said wife, who'd rather be home. "Sorry to bother you, ma'am," Walsh said, and touched the brim of his hat, and the 3 of them wheeled their horses and rode back down the street. Nathan clicked his tongue at the horses. They moved. He did not look back. He did not look at Clara. He kept his eyes on the street, nodding to the people he passed, moving at the unhurried pace of a man with nowhere pressing to be, until Silver Creek was behind them, and the road began its steady climb toward the mountain, and the pines came up on both sides and swallowed the sound of the town whole. He drove for another 10 minutes. Then he pulled the horses to a stop. He turned around on the bench. Clara had come out from under the canvas entirely and was sitting on the edge of the wagon bed, her legs hanging over her bag, still clenched in both hands, and she was looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not quite relief, not quite shame, something that lived in the thin space between the two. "Thank you," she said. Her voice cracked slightly on the second word. "You want to tell me what that was?" Nathan said. She stopped. Started again. "I needed to get out of town. I didn't know whose wagon this was. I just needed—" She closed her eyes for a moment. "I'm sorry. I know it was wrong. I know I put you in a bad position. I'll get down here if you want. I can walk from—" "Where would you walk to?" She opened her eyes, looked at him. "I don't know," she admitted. Nathan studied her for a moment. The afternoon light was filtering gold through the pines, and the horses were blowing softly, and somewhere down the slope, a hawk was making long, lazy circles over the valley. He thought about Ruth, who had once told him that the difference between a good man and a decent man was whether he asked for the full story before he passed judgment. "Walsh works for Charles Beaumont," he said. It wasn't a question. Something moved in Clara's face, quick and painful, like pressing a bruise. "Yes," she said. "All right." Nathan turned back around and picked up the reins. "Then you'd better start from the beginning." She did. It came out slowly at first, the way things come out when a person has been holding them alone for too long, haltingly, with long pauses, with the occasional backtrack when she realized she'd left something out. But it came out. Her name was Clara Whitmore. She had grown up on a small piece of land her father had farmed on the eastern edge of the valley, 20 acres a creek running through the south corner. Good soil. If you worked it right, and her father had worked it right for 30 years. Her mother had kept a kitchen garden and raised chickens and canned enough food every autumn to keep them through the worst winters. And when Clara was small, she had believed the way children believe things, that their life was simple and solid and would go on the way it was. Her father had died 2 springs ago. Not violently, not dramatically. He had gone to bed one evening complaining of a pain behind his left shoulder and had not woken up. Clara had found him in the morning. She had buried him in the garden he'd plowed every spring for 3 decades, in the corner where the wild columbines came up without being asked. 2 weeks later, a man named Gerald Pitt had arrived at her door with a document. "It wasn't a real document," Clara said. "I mean, it had words on it. A seal. It looked real. But it said my father owed Charles Beaumont $430 going back 11 years, with interest compounded annually." She paused. "My father never borrowed money from Charles Beaumont in his life. I know that the way I know my own name." "What kind of man is Beaumont?" Nathan said. He kept his eyes on the road. "The patient kind," Clara said. "That's what makes him dangerous. He doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't threaten, not in ways you can point to. He just arrives. With documents. With witnesses. With this smile that says he's already won and he's just waiting for you to understand that." She looked down at her hands. "He came himself the second time. Said he was willing to be generous. Said he understood I was in a difficult position. Being alone, being a woman, managing a property that was—" She stopped. "That was what?" Nathan said. "He said it was too much for someone like me." Her voice had gone very quiet and very flat. "He looked me over when he said it. The way a man looks at livestock he's considering buying." Nathan's jaw tightened. "He said if I married him, the debt would be forgiven. The land would stay in the family name. He would take care of everything." She laughed, but there was no humor in it, just the shape of a laugh wrapped around something cold. "He made it sound like a kindness, like he was rescuing me from my own life." "And you said no." "The first time I said I needed time to think." She met Nathan's eyes. "I didn't need time to think. I needed time to find the paperwork my father kept in the floorboard under his bed. I needed time to write 3 letters to lawyers in Denver, 2 of whom didn't write back, and 1 of whom wrote back to say that without a witness to the original transaction, a dispute would be very difficult to win against a man of Beaumont's standing." "So you ran." "I ran," she said. "My mother is staying with her sister in Pueblo. I got her out of the county a month ago, told everyone she'd gone to recover from her grief, which wasn't even a lie. I packed what I could carry. I was going to take the stage, but Walsh was watching the station." She glanced at the canvas, then at Nathan. "I saw your wagon. The canvas was already loose at the corner. I made a decision." Nathan was quiet for a moment. "How long before Walsh figures out you weren't my wife?" "I don't know. He might already know. He might not." She shifted on the edge of the wagon bed. "I'm sorry. I know I've made trouble for you. I know you didn't ask for any of this. If you want to put me down at the next crossroad, I understand." Nathan thought about that. He thought about Walsh's face, the particular blankness of a man following orders without examining them. He thought about Beaumont, whom he'd seen twice from a distance, a well-dressed man in his 50s, heavy-jowled with the comfortable certainty of someone who had never in his adult life been told no and believed the word applied to him. He thought about Clara's voice when she'd said the words "too much for someone like me." The way her face had gone completely neutral when she said it, the way a person's face goes neutral when they've had to hear something often enough that they've learned not to react to it on the outside, even though it still lands. "My place is another hour up the mountain," Nathan said. "Road gets rough past the Second Creek crossing. You'll want to get back under the canvas." Clara stared at him. "You're taking me with you." "I'm going home," Nathan said. "You happen to be in my wagon." He glanced back at her over his shoulder. "You can decide what you want to do once we get there." She looked at him for a long moment. Something shifted in her face. Not quite gratitude, because gratitude would have been too simple for what she was feeling, but something adjacent to it, something quieter and more private. She climbed back under the canvas. Nathan faced front, clicked his tongue. The horses began to move again. He didn't examine why he'd done it. He rarely examined things. Ruth had always said that was his most aggravating quality, that he acted from instinct and then constructed his reasoning afterward, like a man who jumps a fence and then decides whether it needed jumping. He had acted from instinct. He would construct the reasoning later. The truth was simpler than he wanted to admit even to himself. He had looked at Clara Whitmore's eyes, at the particular quality in them that said "not done yet." And something in his chest had recognized it the way a man recognizes a landscape he's passed through before. Not in himself, not anymore. But he remembered it. He remembered what it had cost him, and what it had asked of him, and what it had been worth when he'd had it. I wasn't going to drive past that on a public road and pretend he hadn't seen it. That was all. That was the whole of it. The road narrowed as it climbed the pines, pressing in on both sides, the light dropping lower and longer. Nathan drove in silence. Behind him, under the canvas, he could hear the occasional shift of weight, the sounds of a woman holding herself together through sheer determination. He had not brought anyone up this mountain since Daniel died. He had not intended to. I was going to have to think about that. But not now. Now the road needed watching, and the temperature was dropping with the sun, and the horses knew the way home, even if everything else was suddenly and inconveniently uncertain. An hour later, the wagon rolled through the gate of the Cole property. Nathan pulled up in front of his barn, set the brake, and climbed down. He went around to the back and pulled the canvas aside. Clara was sitting upright, her bag in her lap, her hair, a complete disaster, a streak of flour dust across one cheek from where she'd leaned against the sack. She looked exhausted in the profound, bone-deep way of someone who has not truly rested in days. She looked at the barn. At the house beyond it, small, solid, built to survive Colorado winters rather than to impress anyone. At the corral where 4 horses stood in the fading afternoon light, watching the newcomers with the calm curiosity of well-kept animals. "This is yours," she said. "All of it," Nathan said. He held out a hand to help her down. She looked at the hand, then at him. Then, with the decisive movement of a woman who has made a private judgment and acted on it, she took it and stepped down from the wagon. "I'll do whatever work you need," she said immediately. "I'm not asking for charity. I cook, I sew, I can manage a kitchen garden, I know how to mend tack, and I'm not afraid of a long day." She said it all in one breath, like a speech she'd been preparing under the canvas. "I don't know how long I'll need to stay, but however long it is, I'll earn my way." Nathan looked at her for a moment. "You ever deal with horses that don't want to be shod?" She blinked, clearly not what she'd expected. "My father had a mare like that. Took her 3 years to trust the farrier." 3 years, Nathan repeated. "How'd he manage her?" "He never pushed her faster than she was ready to go," Clara said. "He just showed up every day and let her decide." Nathan nodded slowly. "Supper's your call," he said. "There's salt pork in the cellar and dried beans on the shelf above the stove. Cornbread if you can manage it. He turned and began unhitching the horses. Clara stood for a moment in the fading light, looking at the small house, the quiet barn, the wide sweep of Colorado sky above the tree line going pink and copper with the last of the sun. Then she walked to the house. She didn't look back. Nathan watched her go just for a moment, just long enough to note the steadiness of her step, the way she squared her shoulders before she pushed open the door, the way she walked into a stranger's home, with the quiet self-possession of a woman who has decided that surviving is an act of will, and that she intends to keep willing. Then he turned back to the horses. He had work to do. He always had work to do. But for the first time in longer than he wanted to admit, the prospect of going inside when the work was finished didn't fill him with the particular gray, nothing that had lived in his chest for 4 years. He didn't know what to make of that. He would think about it later. He unhitched the horses, led them one by one to their stalls, measured out their feed with the automatic precision of long habit. He forked fresh hay. He checked the water. He latched the barn door against the cold that was coming down fast off the peaks, now the clear cold of a Colorado autumn night that had teeth in it. By the time he walked to the house, a light was burning in the kitchen window. He stopped just outside the door. Through the glass, he could see Clara moving. She'd found an apron on the hook by the stove, had it tied around her waist, was working at the counter with the efficient, unhurried movements of a woman who knows her way around a kitchen and trusts herself in it. The smell of salt pork coming off the fat. The particular sound of dried beans going into a pot. Nathan stood there for a moment longer than necessary. Then he pushed open the door and went inside. "Sit down," Clara said without turning around. "It'll be about 20 minutes. I can—" "You unhitched the horses and brought in the supplies and drove an hour up a mountain," she said. "Sit down." Nathan sat down. The kitchen was warm in a way it hadn't been in years, not since he stopped that thought before it could finish itself. He folded his hands on the table and looked at them and listened to the sounds of supper being made in his house by someone who was not him. It was strange. It was not unpleasant. "Walsh is going to figure it out," Clara said. She was still facing the stove. "If he hasn't already. He's not smart, but he's thorough. Beaumont makes sure the people who work for him are thorough. Then we figure out what to do before he gets here," Nathan said. "You don't have to be part of this," Clara said. She turned then, just enough to look at him over her shoulder. "I'm serious. You helped me get out of town, and I'm grateful for that more than I can tell you. But whatever comes next, that's my problem, not yours." "You're on my land," Nathan said. "I'll leave if you want me to." "I didn't say that." He looked at her steadily. "I said you're on my land. What happens on my land is my concern. That's not a complicated position." Clara turned back to the stove, a long beat. "You're a strange man, Nathan Cole," she said. "So I've been told," he said. Something happened then, something small, almost invisible. A sound that was almost a laugh from her side of the kitchen. Just the breath of it. Barely anything. But it was there. Nathan looked at the window. The dark was coming up fast the way it does in the mountains, and the first stars were already hard and cold above the tree line. He thought about Walsh, about Beaumont, about the particular brand of trouble that attached itself to men who were accustomed to getting what they wanted and had the resources to pursue it. I thought about a woman who had looked at a stranger's wagon and made a split-second calculation that a stranger was safer than the life she was fleeing. He thought about what it cost a person to get to that point. He thought about her eyes. And then Clara set a bowl in front of him. Salt pork and beans, steam rising a piece of cornbread on the side that she'd somehow managed in 20 minutes with a stove she didn't know, and supplies she hadn't chosen, and sat down across from him with her own bowl, and looked at him with those brown eyes that were still tired and still cautious and still had that quality in them that not done yet. And he thought, whatever comes, we'll handle it. He hadn't thought we in 4 years. He picked up his spoon. "You said your mother's in Pueblo," he said. "Yes." "She know you made it out?" Clara looked down at her bowl. "Not yet. I'll find a way to send word when it's safe. There's a man in Durango I trust who runs a freight line. He's reliable. He can get a letter there without it going through Silver Creek." Clara looked up. Something moved through her face, slow, enormous like a landslide that starts small and becomes everything. She pressed her lips together. She looked down again. "Thank you," she said very quietly. Nathan nodded. They ate in silence after that. Not the silence of strangers, but the particular silence of two people who are in the presence of something neither of them is ready to name yet, and who are wise enough or tired enough to let it be unnamed a little longer. Outside, the Colorado night came down absolute and full of stars. Inside, the lamp burned steady. And for the first time in 4 years, Nathan Cole went to sleep in a house that felt in some way he couldn't quite articulate, like it was waiting for something to happen next. He woke before dawn the next morning to the sound of the stove being lit. For one disoriented moment, that particular moment between sleep and waking, when the brain hasn't yet assembled the day, he thought it was Ruth. The familiar sounds of it, the creak of the iron door, the scratch of a match, the soft exhale of someone blowing on a flame. He lay still and let himself have that half second before his mind caught up and reminded him of what year it was and who was gone and what was real. Then he got up. Clara was already dressed, her hair pinned back, working at the stove with the focused competence of someone who'd been up long enough to have already made decisions about the day. She had found the coffee tin. She had water on. She had located, apparently through sheer investigative will, the small cache of dried apples he'd been saving and was adding them to something in a pot. She did not look up when he came in. "You're up early," Nathan said. "I don't sleep much," Clara said. "Haven't for a while." She stirred whatever was in the pot. "There's coffee in about 5 minutes, porridge in 10. I found the apples. I'll replace them when I can get to a store." "You don't need to replace them." "I wasn't asking," she said. Not rudely. Just with the matter-of-fact tone of a woman who has decided certain things about her own conduct and isn't flexible on them. Nathan sat down at the table and looked at his hands and thought about what the day required. Walsh would have reported back to Beaumont by now. Beaumont would have processed the information. The question was what he'd do, whether he'd decide the woman in Nathan Cole's wagon had simply been Nathan Cole's wife, inconveniently unrecognized, and write it off as a dead end, or whether he'd pull at the thread. Beaumont was the kind of man who pulled at threads. "He's going to send someone up here," Nathan said. Clara set 2 cups on the table and poured the coffee and sat down across from him. She wrapped both hands around her cup. She didn't disagree. "I know," she said. "Not today. He'll want more information first. He'll ask around Silver Creek, find out if Nathan Cole actually has a wife, find out who I am." He paused. "He'll find out I don't have a wife." Clara looked at him over the rim of her cup. "Then what?" "Then he'll come here." Nathan drank his coffee. "Or he'll send Walsh. Either way." "If he comes here, you could tell him you don't know where I am," Clara said. "You could say I was just a woman who needed a ride to the crossroads. You don't owe me anything, Nathan. You didn't sign up for his trouble." "I told a man I was married to you on a public street in front of witnesses," Nathan said. "His trouble found me when you opened that canvas." Clara flinched. Small, barely visible, but he saw it. "I know. I'm sorry. I'm not saying it to make you feel bad," Nathan said. "I'm saying it because my options changed the moment I opened my mouth. I'm not one for pretending otherwise." He set his cup down. "The question is, what we do with the position we're in." Clara was quiet for a moment. She looked at her coffee. She was doing that thing again. He noticed the thing where she went very still when she was thinking hard, like she was conserving every resource for the actual problem, not allowing anything to spill. "The papers," she said finally. "The ones my father kept under the floorboard. I have some of them. I brought what I could carry when I left. But there are more. There were more documents, more records, letters he kept from the original surveyor when the land was first registered. I couldn't get to all of them before I had to run." "Where are they?" "Still in the house," she said. "Our house. Beaumont hasn't moved anyone in yet. He's been using it as a storeroom, I think, keeping farm equipment in the front rooms. But the documents in the floorboard, he wouldn't know to look there. My father built that hiding place himself. You'd have to know exactly where to press to get the panel to lift." Nathan looked at her steadily. "You're thinking about going back for them." "I'm thinking," Clara said carefully, "that without those papers, I have a very hard story to prove, And with them, I might have something a lawyer in Denver could actually work with. She met his eyes. I know how that sounds. I know Silver Creek is the last place I should go. It's the last place you should go alone, Nathan said. She stared at him. You'd come with me. I thought about it for exactly as long as it deserved, which was not very long. I go into town every couple of weeks for supplies. Nobody finds it unusual. If you stay in the wagon. No. Clara set her cup down hard. No. I'm not hiding in your wagon again. I won't do it that way. She shook her head. If I go as a person, not as cargo. Nathan looked at her for a moment. All right, he said. All right. It's a bad idea, or all right, you agree. All right, you go as a person, he said. We'll think about the how. He stood up, took his cup to the sink. But not today. Not until we know more about where Beaumont's thinking is. Clara watched him. Something moved through her face that complicated layering of emotions she didn't quite let reach the surface. You make decisions fast, she said. When the situation calls for it, Nathan said. Doesn't scare you. He looked back at her from across the kitchen. What? Getting involved in someone else's trouble, she said. You don't know me. You didn't know me 2 days ago. And now you're talking about riding into Silver Creek to help me steal documents back from one of the most powerful men in the county. She paused. Most people would have let me out at the crossroads. Most people, Nathan said, and left it there. He pulled on his coat and hat and went out to the barn. The morning was cold and clear. The way October mornings in Colorado are cold and clear aggressively, so as if the air is making a point. The horses were awake and restless, wanting their feed, and he spent the first hour of the day in the uncomplicated companionship of animals that needed things he knew how to provide. I was not a man who examined himself constantly. But he was honest enough to recognize that something had shifted in the house overnight. Not dramatically, not in any way. He could have pointed to specifically, but the way a room shifts when you open a window in a house that's been closed for too long. The air moves differently. Things that have gone a little stale begin to clear. He hadn't noticed how quiet it was up here until it wasn't quite as quiet. He shook that thought off and went back to work. Clara came to the barn doorway around mid-morning with a mug of coffee and a piece of cornbread left over from last night. I found a saddle blanket that needs restitching, she said. Along the edge. I can do it if you want. I've got thread in my bag. You don't have to. I know I don't have to, she said in the patient tone of a woman who has now said this twice and would prefer not to have to keep saying it. She held out the coffee and cornbread. Drink that while it's hot. He took it. She leaned against the doorframe watching him eat, and he had the sudden slightly uncomfortable sensation of being assessed. Not critically, just carefully. The way she'd looked at the farm when they arrived, like she was adding things up in her head. How long have you been up here alone? She asked. 4 years, he said. Since your wife. He didn't answer because she hadn't asked it as a question. I'm sorry, Clara said. Truly. It was a long time ago. 4 years isn't that long, she said quietly. Not disagreeing something more complicated than that. The voice of someone who knows what grief actually runs at as opposed to what people tell you it should run at. Time doesn't work the way people say it does. Nathan looked at her. No, he agreed. It doesn't. A pause settled between them, not uncomfortable, the particular pause of two people who have recognized something in each other and are deciding separately what to do with the recognition. My father died 2 springs ago, Clara said, and I still set 2 cups out for morning coffee every day for 6 months before I stopped. Not because I forgot, because it was worse to change the habit than to let it lie. She paused. My mother thought I was managing well because I wasn't crying. I wasn't managing. I was just not crying. Nathan looked at his hands. Yeah, he said. Just that. Clara pushed off the doorframe. I'll see to that saddle blanket. She went back inside. Nathan stood in the barn doorway, holding his empty coffee mug, and thought about a woman who set 2 cups out every morning for 6 months because changing the habit hurt more than keeping it. He went back to work. The days that followed had a rhythm to them that Nathan would not have predicted. He was not a man who adapted easily to change. 4 years of solitary routine had calcified certain habits into something close to religion. But Clara moved into the space of his days with an instinctive tact that he found to his own surprise easy to accommodate. She did not intrude where she wasn't needed. She did not fill silences with chatter. She assessed what was required, and did it, and when she didn't know how to do something, she asked in a way that conveyed practical curiosity rather than helplessness. And when she was told, she learned quickly, and did not need to be told again. She was in the most fundamental sense, competent, deeply, quietly, sometimes startlingly competent, the way people are when they've had to be for a long time. On the third day, she found the broken hinge on the root cellar door that Nathan had been meaning to fix since June. She fixed it herself with tools from his workbench without telling him, and he only found out when he went down for potatoes, and the door swung smooth and silent for the first time in months. He stood there looking at that door for a long moment. On the fourth day, she was in the barn, when one of his horses, a chestnut mare named Bess, who was particular about strangers, and had thrown the last hired hand he'd brought up from the valley, started to get anxious while Clara was working nearby. He came around the corner, ready to call a warning, and found Clara standing very still beside the mare, not touching her, just existing near her, speaking in a low, continuous murmur that was less language than it was sound, the particular verbal texture of patience. Bess had her nose in Clara's shoulder. Nathan stopped. He watched for a moment. Then he went back around the corner and let them be. On the fifth day, the rider came. Nathan heard him before he saw him single horse coming up the mountain road, not rushing. He came out of the barn and stood in the yard, and Clara appeared in the doorway of the house, and they both waited. It was not Walsh. It was a younger man. Nathan half recognized one of the hands who ran errands between Beaumont's properties. He pulled up at the gate and stayed on his horse, which was the choice of a man who was carrying a message and wanted to be able to leave quickly. "Mr. Cole," he said. He touched his hat. He did not look at Clara, which meant he had already clocked her and was very deliberately not looking at her. "What do you need?" Nathan said. "Mr. Beaumont would like to invite you to supper," the young man said. "Saturday evening, at his house. He says to tell you he's heard you recently wed, and he'd like to offer his congratulations in person." The yard was very quiet. Nathan could feel Clara behind him, not looking at her, just aware of her, the precise quality of her stillness. "Tell Mr. Beaumont I appreciate the invitation," Nathan said. "We'll be there." The young man nodded, wheeled his horse, and rode back down the road. The sound of hoofbeats faded into the trees. Clara came down off the porch and stood beside Nathan. "You just agreed to sit across a dinner table from the man who's been hunting me," she said. "I know. That's either very brave or very stupid." "Probably both," Nathan said. He turned and looked at her. "If you're going to go back to that house for those papers, we need to know where Beaumont is, and what he knows, and how confident he is." Clara stared at him. "You want to walk in there so you can read him," she said. "I want you to walk in there," Nathan said, "so you can walk out of your own house the following night while he's trying to figure out how he lost the upper hand." The silence stretched between them. "That's a dangerous plan," Clara said. "Do you have a better one?" She thought about it. Genuinely fully thought about it. He could see it in her face, the working through of angles, the assessment of variables. "No," she said finally. "Then Saturday," Nathan said. He went back to the barn. He heard her exhale behind him, something that was not quite a laugh and not quite a curse. Just the raw sound of a person accepting a situation they didn't choose but are going to face anyway. He understood that sound. He'd made it himself 4 years ago, standing at a graveside on the south slope of his property. Saturday came faster than Nathan expected, or maybe it just felt that way because there was a great deal to think about, and not enough of it reached satisfying conclusions. He knew what Beaumont was doing. He was bringing them to his table, because his table was his territory, because breaking bread on his property was an implicit acknowledgement of his authority, because men like Charles Beaumont understood the symbolic grammar of power very well and used it fluently. He also knew driving down the mountain road that Saturday evening, with Clara sitting beside him on the wagon bench in the best dress she'd been able to manage from the few things in her bag, that Beaumont had not invited them because he was certain. He'd invited them because he was almost certain and wanted to become fully certain, and that almost was the space they had to work with. Clara was quiet on the way down. Not the silence of fear, he'd learned to read her silence by now, its different textures and meanings, but the silence of concentration of someone running through contingencies of a chess player who is thinking 7 moves ahead because 6 is no longer enough. "If he asks how we met," Nathan said, "keep it simple. Simple lies are harder to poke holes in." "I know," Clara said. "We can say we met at the freight station in Durango last spring. You were coming through. I was visiting my cousin." She paused. "Brief courtship. You're not a man given to long ones." He glanced at her. "You've been thinking about this." "All week," she said. He nodded. "If he pushes on dates." "I'll get a headache," Clara said calmly. "Women get headaches at inconvenient moments. It's an established fact." Something moved through Nathan's chest. Amusement real and sudden, which was unusual enough that he noticed it. "All right," he said. Beaumont's house was 3 miles outside of Silver Creek, set back from the road at the end of a long private drive, large and well-maintained in a way that was specifically designed to communicate the owner's financial standing. There were other horses tied out front. He'd invited other guests, Nathan noted. Witnesses. Audience. A Mexican housekeeper showed them in. The front parlor held 5 other guests. The county sheriff, a man named Aldridge whose family owned the mill. 2 women Nathan didn't recognize, and Gerald Pitt, who had been the one to bring Clara's family the false document, and who looked at Clara with an expression that lasted less than a second before he buried it under something bland and social. Nathan caught it. Clara caught it too. He felt her hand tighten briefly on his arm, where she'd tucked it when they came through the door. Beaumont himself came in from a side room. He was exactly what Nathan had expected, and more late 50s, broad-shouldered with white hair, and a face that had been handsome once, and now wore its authority the way some men wear good suits, as if it were simply the natural order of things. He smiled with his whole face when he saw them, and the smile was completely genuine-looking, which was the most unsettling thing about it. "Nathan Cole," he said, coming forward with his hand extended. "I don't believe we've spoken before. I've certainly heard your name. Good man, people say. Good with horses. I've been meaning to find a reason to introduce myself." Nathan shook his hand. "Mr. Beaumont." Beaumont's gaze moved to Clara with the smooth, practiced interest of a man who has long since learned to make assessment look like courtesy. "And this must be your bride," he said. "Welcome, Mrs. Cole. Silver Creek is glad to have you." Clara smiled. It was a genuinely remarkable smile, warm at ease, faintly shy in the way of a new wife in unfamiliar company. Nathan had not known she could produce that smile. It told him a great deal about how much practice she'd had at performing normal under pressure. "Thank you," she said. "It's a beautiful county. I'm so glad Nathan convinced me to give it a chance. How did you two meet?" This came from one of the women Nathan didn't know, asked with the innocent social curiosity of someone who simply wanted the romantic story. But Pitt's head came up very slightly when she asked it, and Nathan felt Beaumont absorb the question without showing anything at all. "Durango," Clara said before Nathan could open his mouth. "Last spring. My cousin runs a millinery there. Nathan was at the freight station. I'm still not entirely certain how we ended up in the same conversation, but he was very persistent." She smiled up at Nathan with the particular sideways look of a woman gently teasing a man she's fond of. "Weren't you?" "Apparently," Nathan said. People laughed. The moment passed. Beaumont guided them all toward the dining room, and Nathan, moving with the group, let his gaze track very quickly around the room, exits layout where Pitt chose to sit. Whether Beaumont positioned himself where he could watch Clara or where he could watch Nathan. He positioned himself where he could watch both. The supper was long. Beaumont was an excellent host in the specific way that powerful men who have spent decades managing rooms full of people are excellent hosts. He directed conversation with light. Invisible pressure drew people out. When it served him. Let silence. Sit when silence was more useful, and watched everything with the focused patience of a man who is waiting for a specific piece of information and is not in any hurry. He asked Clara twice about her family. Both times, she answered with the gentle vagueness of a woman who'd left a difficult past behind and found a better life, touching on a father who'd passed, a mother who was in poor health and resting with relatives, a childhood in a county east of here that she was not particularly eager to revisit. The story had the texture of truth because most of it was true, and the parts that weren't were the kind of small social approximations that everyone in the room had performed themselves at one time or another. Beaumont listened to all of it with that smooth, warm attention. And then, over the dessert course, he said very casually, "You know, I believe I knew a family named Whitmore, out near the East Creek boundary. Fine people, good land over there." He paused, lifting his cup. "Are you any relation, Mrs. Cole?" The table went very quiet, not dramatically, just the natural small pause that follows a question that lands slightly heavier than expected. Clara looked at him. Nathan said nothing, and Clara said, with just enough hesitation to seem like a woman deciding how much to share, rather than a woman who had been waiting for this exact question. "My mother's family distantly, on her side. I didn't know them well." She shook her head gently. "It's a common enough name in the eastern counties." Beaumont smiled. "Of course," he said. "My mistake." But his eyes said something entirely different. His eyes said, "I know exactly who you are, and now I know that you know that I know, and we're going to see what each of us does with that." Nathan set down his fork. "Wonderful meal, Mr. Beaumont," he said. "We should head home before the mountain road gets too dark. My wife gets nervous on it." He looked at Clara, and the look said now. Clara pressed her hand to her temple. "Oh," she said softly. "I'm so sorry. I think I've got one of my headaches coming on. The lamplight. I should have said before. I do apologize." The exit was made in 5 minutes, smooth and gracious, and full of the kind of warm social noises that let everyone leave with their dignity intact. Beaumont walked them to the door himself. He shook Nathan's hand. He said all the right things. He smiled. But when Clara turned to climb up onto the wagon bench, Beaumont said very quietly, very close to Nathan's ear, "Fine woman you've got there, Cole. I hope she stays well." Nathan looked at him. "She will," he said. Equally quiet, equally clear. He climbed up onto the bench. He took the reins. He drove away at a normal pace down the long private drive out onto the road. They were a half-mile out before Clara said in a voice that was completely steady, "He knows." "He's not certain," Nathan said. "He will be, by tomorrow morning." She paused. "He'll have someone at our door by the day after." "Then tomorrow night," Nathan said. Clara turned to look at him. "We're going to the house." "You're going to the house," Nathan said, "to get what you need. I'm going to be where I need to be to make sure you get out." She was quiet for a moment. "Nathan." "What? Why are you doing this?" she asked. Not the social, modest version of the question, the real one. The one that asked about the actual internal accounting, the cost-benefit ledger of a man who did not have to be involved in any of this, and had chosen to be anyway. Nathan drove in silence for a moment. He thought about Ruth, who had once said that a man who couldn't explain his own motivations was either a fool or a coward, and Nathan had said he was probably some of both, and she had laughed and said that at least he knew it. "Because nobody stopped what happened to you," he said finally, "and they should have. And somebody should now." He paused. "That's the whole of it." Clara did not say anything, but when they came to the roughest part of the mountain road, where the trail narrowed and the horses needed to work, she took hold of the edge of the bench with one hand to brace herself, and her other hand she laid quietly on the seat between them, not touching him, just close. Nathan looked at the road ahead. He did not move his hand away. The night came down around them cold and absolute, and the stars were thick above the tree line, and the horses knew their way home, even in the dark, which was good, because Nathan was thinking about tomorrow, and all the ways it could go wrong, and the smaller number of ways it could go right, and what was worth risking for which outcome. He thought about Clara standing in the barn doorway, with a mug of coffee and a piece of cornbread. He thought about the sound of a stove being lit before dawn. He thought about a mare named Bess with her nose tucked into a woman's shoulder. He thought about 2 cups set out every morning for 6 months, and he thought some things are worth the risk of getting wrong. The lights of the farm came into view through the trees. He guided the horses through the gate. He set the brake, and Clara sat beside him for a moment before either of them moved, looking at the small house with the dark windows, the solid barn, the wide sky above it all. And he did not know what she was seeing when she looked at it, but he suspected it was not entirely what she'd expected to see when she'd thrown herself into a stranger's wagon 6 days ago, with nothing left but the documents in her bag, and the particular fierce quality in her eyes that said she was not done yet. "Tomorrow night," she said. "Tomorrow night," he agreed. They climbed down and went inside. They did not sleep much that night. Nathan lay awake, running the plan through his head, the way he ran fence lines methodically, looking for weak spots, places where the wire might give under pressure. Clara, in the small room off the kitchen that had been Daniel's, was quiet, but not the quiet of sleep. He could hear the occasional creak of the floorboard, the sound of someone sitting up, lying back down, sitting up again. The house held both of them in their separate wakefulness, like a cupped hand. By 4 in the morning, he gave up on sleep, entirely dressed, and went to the kitchen. Clara was already there. She was sitting at the table with her bag open in front of her, going through the documents she'd brought when she ran, sorting them into piles with the focused, careful movements of someone who has done this before, who has sat with these papers in lamplight and tried to understand what they meant and what they were worth, and whether they were enough. She looked up when he came in. She did not look surprised to see him. "I've been going through what I have," she said. "There's a letter here from the original land surveyor, a man named Casper Ellis, out of Denver. Dated 1871. It records the boundaries of the property and confirms my father's ownership free and clear, no liens, no encumbrances." She set it aside. "There's a receipt book partial that shows my father's payments on the small crop loan he did take out back in '78. A real loan from a real bank, fully repaid by 1881. She paused. "And there's a letter from my father to my mother written the winter before he died. He mentions Beaumont by name. He says Beaumont approached him, offered to buy the land at a price that was less than half its value, and my father turned him down." She looked at Nathan. "He wrote that Beaumont didn't argue, just smiled and said he understood. My father wrote that the smile bothered him more than an argument would have." Nathan sat down. "That's all in what you have with you?" "Yes. And the rest is still in the house." "The rest is the most important part," Clara said. She pressed her fingertips together on the table. "My father kept carbon copies of every piece of correspondence he ever wrote. He was meticulous about it. He didn't trust his own memory, he said. The copies would be in a leather folder in the floorboard compartment. If Beaumont made any written approach before he switched to the false debt documents, my father would have copies of those letters." She paused. "If Beaumont put anything in writing even once that contradicts what he's claiming now, we have him. And if he never put anything in writing, then we have what we have," Clara said quietly, "and we make it work as best we can." Nathan looked at the papers on the table. At the surveyor's letter, carefully preserved, the ink brown with age, but still perfectly legible. At the receipt book, its columns of careful numbers representing 30 years of a man's honest labor. "We go in after midnight," Nathan said. "Beaumont will have someone watching the road to your property, maybe Walsh, maybe one of his hands. Not inside the house. He won't put anyone inside until he's got legal standing to claim it, and he doesn't have that yet. He's still operating on the assumption that the false documents are enough." "He's put a lock on the front door," Clara said. "A padlock. I saw it when I left." "Windows. The kitchen window has always stuck, never latched properly. My father meant to fix it every summer for 10 years. She paused. "He never got around to it." Something passed across Nathan's face, not quite a smile, but the ghost of one. "Your father sounds like a man I would have liked." Clara looked at her hands. "He was," she said. "He was the kind of man who did things right even when no one was watching. Not because he was afraid of being caught, but because he didn't know how to do things wrong." She was quiet for a moment. "That's why this is so. That's why I can't let Beaumont—" She stopped. "I know," Nathan said. She looked up at him. "You do, don't you?" she said. Not a question. Just a recognition, the quiet acknowledgement of one person seeing another one clearly. Your father built something honest, Nathan said. A man like Beaumont's entire operation depends on making honest people believe their honest work can be taken from them. If you let him have this, he does it again. To the next family. And the one after that. He paused. People like him only stop when someone makes it cost more than it's worth. Clara held his gaze for a long moment. We should get some sleep, she said finally. Probably, Nathan agreed. Neither of them moved for another hour. They went over every detail. Instead, the layout of the house, the floorboard's location, the exact pressure point to open the panel. Which direction was fastest out the kitchen window, where Nathan would position himself, what the signal was if something went wrong. Clara drew the interior of the house from memory, on the back of an old feed bill, her hand moving with the confident precision of a woman who had known every inch of that space since childhood. Nathan studied it, asked questions, committed it to memory, the way he committed trail routes, not by rote, but by understanding the logic of the space, so that if something changed, he could adapt. By the time dawn came, the plan was as solid as they could make it. The day passed slow and strange, full of ordinary tasks, performed by two people who were thinking about something other than the tasks. Nathan repaired a section of fence along the north pasture. Clara baked bread, mended the saddle blanket she'd found earlier in the week, spent an hour with Bess in the corral, in a quiet exchange that Nathan observed from a distance without intending to. The mare was following her now, unhitched from the lead, just following the way horses follow people they've decided to trust. He didn't let himself think too much about that. Around midday, a rider passed on the road below the property. Not stopping, just passing, but moving slowly enough that Nathan clocked him as a watcher rather than a traveler. Beaumont was not wasting any time, he told Clara at supper. She nodded. He'll pull the watcher before midnight. His men like their sleep, and he knows we're up on the mountain. He won't think we'd come down in the dark. She paused. He doesn't know me as well as he thinks he does. He doesn't know you at all, Nathan said. She looked at him across the table. No, she said. He really doesn't. They left the farm at 11:30. No lantern. Nathan knew the mountain road well enough in the dark to not need one, and a light would announce them to anyone with eyes on the valley. They rode two horses, Nathan on his gray gelding, Clara on Bess, who moved quietly and without complaint in the way of a horse that has made a specific person its current project. The ride down was cold and wordless and taut, the way the air gets before a storm when everything holds its breath. Nathan kept his senses wide open, listening for hoofbeats that weren't theirs, watching for movement in the brush along the road. Nothing. The valley was still. Beaumont's watcher, as Clara had predicted, was gone. They came to the Whitmore property from the back, dismounting in the trees and tying the horses to an aspen branch. The house was dark. Nathan followed Clara through the tall autumn grass to the kitchen side, moving the way he moved when he was tracking low, steady, no wasted motion. The kitchen window was exactly where she'd said, and it stuck exactly as she'd described, warped from years of weather, never latched properly, resistant, but not impossible. Clara pressed her palms flat against the frame and pushed with her weight behind it. And after a moment of obstinate resistance, it gave silent and sudden, and she was through it before Nathan had fully processed the movement. He went in after her. The house smelled of old wood and someone else's presence farm equipment. Axle grease, the ghost of her family's life, underneath it all. Clara moved through the dark interior without hesitation, her feet knowing the floor by memory, and Nathan followed the sound of her breathing and the faint white blur of her dress. She stopped, knelt. He heard her fingers working along the floorboard, pressing, testing, finding the specific place. The soft click of a panel lifting. Here, she breathed. He heard paper. The dry whisper of a leather folder. Her hands moving through it quick and sure. It's here, she said. All of it. It's here. And that was when they heard the front door. Not someone trying the lock. The lock opening. A key turning slow and deliberate in the unmistakable sound of someone who had every right to use it and wanted the people inside to hear them coming. Clara's hands froze. Nathan's hand went to his side automatically where he'd worn his gun for 20 years on instinct if nothing else. The door opened. A lantern came through it. Behind the lantern, Charles Beaumont. He was not alone. Walsh was behind him, and two other men Nathan hadn't seen before, large, the kind of large that was employed rather than incidental. Beaumont raised the lantern and looked across the dark room at the two of them. Clara kneeling on the floor, the leather folder in her hands, the panel open at her knees. Nathan standing 2 feet behind her, absolutely still. Beaumont smiled. "Well," he said pleasantly, "here we are." The silence in the room was the kind that has weight to it. Clara stood up. She did not close this folder. She did not hide it behind her back. She straightened to her full, the folder held against her chest, the way she'd held her bag in Nathan's wagon. Both hands white-knuckled the last solid thing, and she looked at Charles Beaumont across the dark room without flinching. "Mr. Beaumont," she said. Her voice was completely level. "Miss Whitmore," Beaumont said. "Or is it Mrs. Cole? I confess I've been uncertain which applies." "This is my family's home," Clara said. "These are my family's documents. I have every right to be here." Beaumont tilted his head, the patient, faintly sad expression of a man performing reluctant authority. "I'm afraid that's not quite accurate. The property transferred to my ownership pursuant to the debt agreement signed." "There was no debt agreement," Clara said. "There was a document your man Pitt produced with my father's name forged on it after my father was dead and unable to dispute it." She held up the leather folder. "And there are 23 years of correspondence in this folder that proves it." Beaumont looked at the folder for just a fraction of a second. Something shifted behind his eyes. Not fear, not exactly, but the flicker of a man recalculating. It was small, and it was fast, and it was the most honest thing Nathan had ever seen Charles Beaumont do. Then it was gone. "That folder," Beaumont said, "was on my property. Anything found on my property belongs to me." "Take one step toward her," Nathan said. His voice was quiet. It was the specific quiet of a man who is not angry, who has passed anger into something colder and more deliberate. Beaumont looked at him. Walsh looked at him. The two large men in the back shifted their weight. "Mr. Cole," Beaumont said with the patient tone of a man explaining something to someone slow, "you're standing in my house in the middle of the night and you've just watched your wife commit theft on my property. I don't think your position here is as strong as you might imagine." "My position is standing between you and her," Nathan said. "That position is strong enough." Beaumont studied him for a long moment. "Walsh," he said. Walsh moved forward, and the kitchen window opened again. 3 men came through it. Nathan had not arranged for 3 men to come through the kitchen window. He had not arranged for any men to come through the kitchen window. He had not told anyone they were coming here tonight. He had not spoken to a soul beyond Clara since they'd come down the mountain. But 3 men came through the window, and the door now, which had not been latched behind Beaumont, swinging open to admit 2 more, and Nathan knew the faces of 2 of them. Harlan Goss, who ran the feed store in Silver Creek, and old August Meyer, who had the property 3 valleys over, and who Nathan had not spoken to in 2 years. Harlan Goss, who was 62 years old and not a physically impressive man, stepped into the room and looked at Beaumont and said in the voice of a man who has been waiting to say something for a very long time, "Evening, Charles." Beaumont's expression did not change, but the lantern moved slightly in his hand. "Harlan," he said, "what is this?" "I heard there was some confusion about the Whitmore property tonight," Harlan said, "and some of us thought it might be useful to have witnesses." He looked at Clara. He took off his hat. "Miss Clara, I knew your father since before you were born. He was one of the finest men I have ever known, and what has been done to this property is an offense that should have been stopped long before tonight." Clara stared at him. Her composure, the extraordinary iron composure she had held through Beaumont's entrance and Walsh's movement, and the whole of the confrontation, cracked just slightly at the edges. Just enough. "Mr. Goss," she said barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry it took us this long," Harlan said simply. "That's on us." August Meyer spoke next from the doorway, in the blunt, direct way of a man who did not spend words carelessly. I brought my copy of the surveyor's records from when this county was first settled. The Whitmore land was registered clean in 1869. I was there. He looked at Beaumont. I was a witness on the original filing. Beaumont set the lantern down on the windowsill. He looked around the room at the men who had come through windows and doors, at Clara, standing with the leather folder pressed to her chest, at Nathan between them, like a fence post that was not going to move. He was counting. Nathan could counting numbers, counting options, running the arithmetic of a man who has miscalculated badly and is trying to find a way to reframe the equation. This is a civil matter, Beaumont said. It requires legal resolution, not. Agreed, said a new voice from the doorway. Everyone turned. The man who had just arrived was not from Silver Creek. Nathan had never seen him before. He was slight, sharp-faced, perhaps 45, wearing a town coat that was dusty from travel, and carrying a leather case that he held with the care of a man who understood its contents. He looked at Clara. Miss Whitmore, I'm James Alderman. I'm an attorney from Denver. You wrote to me 4 months ago. He paused. I apologize for the delay in responding. I came as quickly as I could when I understood the situation. He looked at Beaumont with the level, incurious gaze of a man who has spent his career looking at men like him across tables in courtrooms. Mr. Beaumont, I believe, we have a great deal to discuss. The room was completely silent. Nathan watched Beaumont. He had seen men lose at cards. He had seen men lose fights. He had even seen men lose things that mattered to them, land animals standing. There was a particular expression that came on a man's face in that moment when he understood that the ground had shifted entirely, and no amount of money or authority was going to shift it back. He was watching that expression settle onto Charles Beaumont's face now. It was not dramatic. It was very quiet. Just the slow rearrangement of the features of a man who has spent decades winning and is encountering the unfamiliar texture of having lost. This isn't finished, Beaumont said, to no one in particular, or to all of them, or to himself. No, Nathan agreed. But it started. Beaumont looked at him. Something passed between them. Not respect, not quite, but the acknowledgement of an adversary. Then Beaumont picked up his lantern, looked at Walsh, and walked out through the front door. Walsh and the two large men followed. Nobody in the room said anything until the sound of their horses had faded down the road. Then Harlan Goss let out a breath that sounded like it had been held for a very long time. Lord above, he said. Clara sat down on the floor, not dramatically, not in collapse. She sat down the way a person sits down when their legs make a decision their brain hasn't approved yet, the controlled, deliberate descent of someone who realizes suddenly that they have been holding an enormous amount of tension for an enormous amount of time, and that the immediate crisis has just passed. Nathan crouched down beside her. She looked at him. Her eyes were bright. Not with tears, she was not going to cry in front of a room full of people. He understood that about her by now. But with the fierce, overwhelmed luminosity of a person who has just survived something they weren't entirely certain they'd survive. You knew, she said. You arranged this. I rode down 3 days ago, Nathan said. Talked to Harlan. Talked to August, wrote to a few others. He paused. Turned out I wasn't the only one who'd been watching what Beaumont did to your family and feeling bad about watching. Clara stared at him. 3 days ago, she said, before we even went to his dinner. I wanted to know what we were walking into, Nathan said. It seemed useful to have something already in place if it went badly. You could have told me, she said. I didn't want to give you something else to carry, he said. You were carrying enough. She held his gaze for a long moment. Something moved through her face, large and complicated and private the way the biggest things always are. Then she looked down at the leather folder still in her hands. My father kept everything, she said softly. Every letter, every receipt, every little piece of paper. My mother used to tease him about it. She said he was going to drown them both in paper one day. She pressed her hand flat on the folder. He wasn't being fussy. He was protecting us. He just didn't know it. He knew something, Nathan said. Men who keep records know something. James Alderman, the lawyer, crouched down on Clara's other side with the folder open across his knees, leafing through it with quick, experienced eyes. "This is substantial," he said. "The surveyor's correspondence alone is significant. If there are copies of any letters from Beaumont or his representatives making claims about the land prior to the debt document." "Third section," Clara said. "Brown ribbon." Alderman found it. He read. He read for a full minute in silence while the room stood around him and nobody spoke. Then he said, "Beaumont himself wrote to your father in the summer of 1887. He offered to purchase the land at a named price. Your father's response, a carbon copy, declines the offer and states explicitly that the land is not for sale at any price." He looked up. "And then Beaumont's next piece of correspondence, dated 4 months later, claims your father had owed him money since 1879. He paused. "There is no mention of any debt in the summer 1887 letter. No reference to it at all. A man owed money for 8 years does not fail to mention it when writing a purchase offer." "No," Harlan Goss said from across the room. "He does not." Alderman closed the folder. He looked at Clara. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I believe we can resolve this. It will not be instant, courts take time, but with this documentation and with the witnesses. In this room, I believe we can establish fraud, restore the title to your family, and potentially bring additional charges against Beaumont and his associate Pitt for forgery." He paused. "I should have responded to your letter sooner. I apologize for that." Clara looked at him for a moment. "You're here now," she said. It was the most gracious response she could have given, and it was also, Nathan thought, entirely typical of her. The economy of it, the lack of wasted recrimination, the willingness to move forward from where things were rather than where they should have been. She stood up. She was still holding the folder. She pressed it once against her chest, just once, a brief private gesture that was for herself and no one else. A small moment with a man who had spent 30 years making careful carbon copies of letters, who had built a hidden panel in his own floor, who had looked at a powerful man's false smile and written to his wife that night that the smile bothered him, who had been right, whose daughter was standing in his kitchen holding the proof. Then she looked at Harlan Goss and August Meyer and the other men who had come through windows and doors on a cold October night. "Thank you," she said. "All of you. I don't have the right words for—" "Your father would have done the same," Harlan said simply. "He did do the same for some of us in years past. We were late returning the favor, that's all." Nathan stood beside her and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed to be added. Alderman spent the next hour going through the folder in full, making notes in the quick, compressed hand of a lawyer building a case. The neighbors sat and drank water from the pump. Clara found still working in the kitchen and talked in the low, comfortable voices of people who have just done something difficult together and are processing it in the way of their kind. Not dramatically, not with speeches, just with the ordinary warmth of people who understand each other. Clara moved through all of it with that same composure, that same quiet competence. Answering Alderman's questions, pointing him to specific documents, occasionally providing context that only someone who had grown up in this house could provide. She was not trembling. She was not overwhelmed. She was, Nathan thought, watching her from across the room, precisely what she had always been. What nobody in Silver Creek had properly seen because they'd been too busy looking at what they expected to see, rather than what was actually there. A woman who knew exactly who she was and what she was worth. A woman who had been told repeatedly by the town's silence, if not its words, that she was less than she was, too large, too female, too alone, too easy to dismiss, and had decided somewhere along the line that she was not going to let that calculation stand. She looked up and caught Nathan watching her. He didn't look away. She held his gaze for a moment, the same moment they'd had in the barn, in the kitchen, on the Wagon road, all the quiet, accumulated moments of two people who have been honest with each other in the specific way that proximity and pressure make inevitable. Then Alderman asked her something, and she turned back to answer him. Nathan went to stand in the doorway looking out at the night. The cold was still and deep. The stars were out. Down the road nothing moved. Beaumont and his men were gone, at least for tonight. The valley lay quiet in the dark, the way the valley always lay quiet in the dark. indifferent and beautiful and permanent in the way that only land is permanent. He thought about a lot of things standing there. He thought about what came next. The legal process. Beaumont's inevitable counterattack. The long and probably expensive work of undoing what had been done. He thought about Clara's house, and Clara's land, and Clara's right to both. He thought about his own farm on the mountain, the fence that needed work, and the horses that needed tending, and the long Colorado winter coming in fast. He thought about what it meant that he had ridden down 3 days ago to talk to Harlan Goss. He had told himself it was strategy. Preparation. The logical thing to do given the situation. And it was those things. But he had also driven home that evening back up the mountain and come into the kitchen, and Clara had been at the stove, and the lamp had been lit, and something in his chest had moved with such simple and inconvenient certainty that he had stood in the doorway for a full 10 seconds before she heard him and turned around. I was not a man who ignored the things that moved in his chest. He was just a man who needed time. August Meyer came to stand beside him in the doorway. They stood together in the comfortable silence of men who don't need to fill space. "She's something," August said eventually. "Yes," Nathan said. "Her father was too." A pause. Man like Beaumont couldn't stand it. That kind of uprightness, it offends them. Makes them need to break it. August was quiet for a moment. "Glad it didn't break." "It didn't come close," Nathan said. August glanced at him. Something in the old man's face, a small private acknowledgement, one man to another of a thing, neither of them was going to say out loud. "Cold night," August said. "Getting colder," Nathan agreed. August went back inside. Nathan stayed in the doorway a moment longer. Then Clara appeared beside him, the folder under her arm, the lawyer's case closed on the table behind her, the neighbors beginning to gather their coats and hats for the ride home. She stood next to him and looked out at the dark valley. "We have what we need," she said. "I know. It'll take time, months maybe. The lawyer says a year at the outside." "Things worth having take time," Nathan said. She was quiet. "I don't know where I'll be during that time," she said carefully. "I don't know where I don't know what the right—" She stopped, started again. "I have the house here, but it's not—" She stopped again, pressed her lips together. "I don't know how to say what I'm trying to say." Nathan looked at her. "You don't have to go anywhere," he said. Clara looked at him. "The mountain," he said. "The farm. There's enough room, for as long as it takes, for as long as you need." He paused. He was not a man who said things he didn't mean. He was also not. It turned out a man who could leave the important things unsaid when the moment required them said. And if it turned out you needed it permanently, that would be all right with me too. The night was very quiet around them. Clara looked at his face for a long time. Not searching, she had already been looking for a long time in the particular continuous way she looked at things she was in the process of deciding. She had been deciding about this since a cold morning in his kitchen when she'd said, "Time doesn't work the way people say it does," and he'd said, "No, it doesn't," and something quiet and enormous had happened in the space between those two sentences. "That's a large thing to offer someone," she said. "I'm aware," Nathan said. "You've been alone for 4 years." "I know how long I've been alone," he said. "I counted." Something moved in her face, small and warm and real, the closest thing to fully unguarded he had ever seen from her. "I'm not easy," she said. "I have opinions. I'll fix things that aren't broken and rearrange things that don't need rearranging and argue with you when I think you're wrong." "I know," he said. "You haven't even seen me when I'm not running from something," she said. "You don't know what I'm like when I'm not." "Clara," he said. She stopped. "I know what you're like," he said. "I've been watching for 2 weeks." She held his gaze. She swallowed. "All right," she said, softly. Just those 2 words. Behind them. Harlan Goss called out a good night, and the sound of neighbors leaving filled the house, hoofbeats, low voices, the creak of saddles. The ordinary sounds of good people going home after doing the right thing. Clara turned back inside to thank them. Nathan stayed in the doorway a moment longer, looking out at the dark valley at the land that was going to be hers again, because she had refused to let it be taken at the stars above the tree line that did not care about human affairs but were beautiful anyway. He thought Ruth would have liked her. He was sure of it. More sure of it than he'd been sure of many things. He turned and went back inside. James Alderman rode back to Denver 3 days later with the leather folder secured in his case and a list of witnesses that ran to 14 names. He did not promise miracles. He was the kind of lawyer who understood that promising miracles was how you lost clients and cases both. And he said so plainly on the morning he left, standing in the yard of the Whitmore property while Nathan held his horse and Clara stood with her arms crossed against the cold. "This will move through the territorial court," Alderman said. "Beaumont will file a counter-challenge. He'd be a fool not to, and whatever else he is, he's not a fool. He'll claim the documents are forgeries, that the witnesses are motivated by personal grudges, that the debt was legitimate, and your father simply failed to disclose it to you." He looked at Clara. "He'll make this about your credibility as much as the documents. You should be prepared for that." "I've been prepared for that my whole life," Clara said. Alderman looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once and rode south. They watched him go. "He's right," Nathan said. "About Beaumont countering." "I know he's right," Clara said. "Beaumont's been countering me since the day he walked onto our land. The difference is, now I have someone countering back." She unfolded her arms. "Let's go home." It was the first time she'd said it that way, home, with the particular casual weight of a word used without thinking, because it has become true without announcement. Nathan did not remark on it. He simply turned the horses and they rode back up the mountain, and the word sat between them in the clean cold air, self-evident and quiet, like something that had always been true and had only recently been said aloud. The weeks that followed had their own particular rhythm, different from the uneasy provisional rhythm of the first 2 weeks. Something had settled, not resolved. The legal matter was very much unresolved, and Beaumont's silence in the aftermath of that night was the silence of a man reorganizing rather than retreating, but settled in the sense that both of them had stopped moving around each other with the careful, courteous distance of people who don't know how long they'll share a space. Clara moved into the house the way she moved into everything, practically thoroughly, with an eye for what was needed and a complete absence of sentimentality about the process. She reorganized the kitchen shelves in a way that made more sense, which Nathan observed and did not comment on, because it did in fact make more sense. She put curtains on the windows in the room that had been Daniel's practical curtains, heavy enough to block the morning light. She started a kitchen garden on the south side of the house, even though it was October and nothing would grow until spring, because she said you had to know where the soil was before you could know how to work it. She was right. She was often right in the practical, observational way of someone who has spent years managing things with limited resources and no margin for error. Nathan found that he adjusted to being often wrong with more ease than he expected. He found a lot of things easier than he expected. He did not examine this too closely. He had told Clara he'd been watching for 2 weeks, and he knew what she was like, and that was true. But he was also honest enough to admit alone in the early morning hours, when he was tending the horses and the rest of the world was still dark and quiet, that what he knew was the edge of something much larger, and that the larger thing was at once exciting and terrifying, and not something he had experience with anymore. He had been in love once with Ruth, and he had known from the beginning with Ruth the same electric certainty he felt now, and that certainty had been right. How was fairly certain it was right now too. How was less certain what to do about it, which was new. With Ruth, he had simply acted, had said what he felt directly, and without navigation, because Ruth had been a woman who responded to directness and didn't have patience for anything else. Clara was different. Not more complicated, just differently complicated, carrying things that Ruth had never had to carry, with a wariness that was not about Nathan personally, but about the world and its habit of lying to her about the nature of her own worth. I didn't want to be one more thing that moved too fast and then changed. So he was careful. Careful in the way. He was. Careful with the horses. Present. Steady. Consistent. No sudden moves. Letting the trust build at the speed it needed to build rather than the speed he wanted it to. He was not naturally patient. He was working on it. The first sign that Beaumont was reorganizing came on a Tuesday in late October, when Harlan Goss sent a boy up the mountain with a note that said simply, "Beaumont's brought in a lawyer from Santa Fe. Man named Croft. Heard he's expensive. Thought you should know." Nathan read the note, handed it to Clara. She read it, folded it, set it on the table. "Croft," she said. "You know the name. By reputation. He worked for a mining company out of Taos 3 years ago. Small ranchers were claiming the company had filed false boundaries to absorb their grazing land." She paused. "The ranchers lost." Nathan looked at her. "How do you know that?" he asked. "Because when my father first came to me about Beaumont's original offer, I started paying attention to how Beaumont operated. I started reading everything I could find about similar situations." She met his eyes. "I've been building this case in my head for 2 years, Nathan. Long before I ran. Long before Alderman. I just didn't have anyone to build it with." He sat with that for a moment. The image of Clara Whitmore sitting alone in a farmhouse kitchen with a lamp burning late reading legal notices from other counties, building a case she didn't yet have the means to make, while Beaumont smiled at her across rooms and called it generosity. "Tell me what you know about Croft," he said. She told him. It took an hour. She was precise, organized, detailed, the same quality of mind she brought to everything, the same comprehensive attention she'd brought to the floorboard documents and the dinner at Beaumont's table, and the layout of her own house in the dark. When she was done, Nathan had a clear picture of a lawyer who was skilled at procedural delay, at drowning opposing cases in paperwork, and continuances, at making the legal process so expensive and exhausting that smaller opponents simply gave up. "He's counting on us running out of money," Nathan said. "Yes," Clara said. "And time. Winter's coming. Roads close. Court dates get pushed. He'll use every mechanism available to slow this down until we're either broke or demoralized or both." "Are you demoralized?" She looked at him across the table. "What do you think?" He almost smiled. "No, I think you're the opposite of demoralized." "Then we write to Alderman tonight," she said, "and tell him to expect Croft's tactics and tell him what we know." She paused. "And tomorrow, I need to ride to Durango." "Durango," Nathan repeated. "What's in Durango?" "There's a woman named Margaret Holt. She runs a boarding house on the main street. She used to work for Charles Beaumont back in the late 70s, before she left his employ very suddenly." Clara's eyes were steady. "My father mentioned her in a letter to my mother once. He said she'd left because she'd seen something she refused to be part of. He never specified what. But he wrote it down, and it's in that folder, and Alderman has it now, and I think it's time someone went and asked Margaret Holt what she saw." Nathan looked at her for a long moment. "You've been thinking about this for a while," he said. "Since I was in the barn with Bess 3 days ago," Clara said. "Thinking time. She's very patient company." Nathan stood up. "I'll saddle the horses before light. You don't have to come. You're not going to Durango alone," Nathan said in the tone he used when something was simply not a point of discussion. He half expected her to argue. She argued when she thought he was wrong, which was one of the things he'd come to rely on. But she looked at him for a moment and then nodded. "Before light," she agreed. They rode out at 4:30 the next morning. It was a long ride. 8 hours south through country that was beautiful and demanding in the specific way of Colorado mountain terrain in late autumn, with the aspens all stripped now, and the higher peaks beginning to show real snow, and the air carrying the iron smell of winter coming in earnest. Nathan rode beside Clara, and they talked sometimes and were quiet other times, and the quality of the silence between them was the kind that is not a gap but a presence. The comfortable, specific silence of two people who have stopped performing ease and simply have it. At one point on a long, flat stretch above the valley floor, Clara said, "Tell me about Ruth." Nathan looked at the road ahead. "That's a direct question," he said. "Yes," Clara said. He was quiet for a moment. "What do you want to know?" "Whatever you want to tell me," she said. "Or nothing if that's what you want. I'm not—" She paused. "I'm not asking to know your whole history. I'm asking because she mattered to you, and I'd like to know about the things that matter to you." He thought about it. "She laughed at everything," he said finally. Not unkindly. She just found the world amusing mostly, even the hard parts. She used to say that if you couldn't find something funny about a bad situation, you weren't looking at it from the right angle. He paused. She was usually right. It was occasionally irritating. Clara smiled. A real one, small and warm. How did you meet? She asked. Stage stop outside of Trinidad. She was waiting for a stage that was 6 hours late and had apparently decided to solve the problem by reorganizing the station keeper's supply room while he wasn't looking. He paused. I arrived to find a man standing outside his own supply room, looking very confused, and when I went in to see what had happened, there was a woman in there explaining very patiently why his original system had been inefficient. Clara's smile widened. She sounds magnificent. She was, Nathan said, simple and complete. Clara was quiet for a moment. Are you afraid, she said carefully, that anything good that happens now is somehow... She stopped. Tried again. Are you afraid it means forgetting? Nathan looked at her. He had not been asked that, had not asked it of himself, not in those words, though he had circled around it in the 4 years of solitary mornings and deliberate not thinking. I used to be, he said. I don't think I am anymore. What changed? He looked at her for a moment. I met someone who understood that time doesn't work the way people say it does. Clara held his gaze. Then she faced forward toward the road ahead and said nothing, and he said nothing, and the horses moved south through the big Colorado quiet, and it was enough. Margaret Holt was not what Nathan expected. She was in her early 60s, spare and upright with sharp gray eyes and the manner of a woman who has survived considerable difficulty through the specific application of her own intelligence. She ran a clean, well-organized boarding house and had clearly been running it that way for many years. She looked at Clara and Nathan when they appeared at her door with the assessing, unhurried gaze of someone who spent her days reading strangers. Miss Whitmore, she said when Clara gave her name. She didn't seem surprised. I heard there was trouble up in Silver Creek, with the Whitmore land. You heard, Clara said. Word travels. Margaret opened the door wider. Come in. I've been wondering if someone would come and ask me what I know. She led them to her sitting room. She poured coffee without asking. She sat down across from them and folded her hands and said without preamble, I worked for Charles Beaumont for 4 years, from 1876 to 1880. I kept his accounts and managed his correspondence. I was good at my job and he knew it, and for a while that was a satisfactory arrangement. She paused. In the spring of 1879, Beaumont acquired a piece of land on the north boundary of what was then open grazing range. The family that had been working that land for 12 years had no documentation. They'd settled it before the territorial surveys relied on common law usage rights. She looked at her coffee. He did not forge documents that time. He simply filed a claim faster than they could, and he had a lawyer who knew which clerks to approach and how to approach them. She paused. The family lost everything. The father, an older man not in good health, died the following winter. His wife moved to a daughter's house in New Mexico. Nobody spoke. I kept the accounts, Margaret said. I knew what he'd done. I knew how he'd done it. And when he began preparing a similar strategy for a second family, I told him I would not keep those accounts. She looked at Clara. He didn't threaten me. He didn't need to. He simply explained very pleasantly that without a reference from him, I would find it very difficult to find comparable employment in the territory, and that my choices were to continue or to leave quietly. She paused. I left quietly. I have regretted the quiet ever since. You'd testify to this, Nathan said. In court. Margaret looked at him steadily. Why do you think I kept records of my own? She said. She got up, went to a cabinet on the far wall, and returned with a folder thinner than Clara's father's, but with the same quality of careful, deliberate preservation. I kept copies of every account I worked on for Beaumont that had any irregularity. I kept them because I knew even when I was choosing quiet, that quiet was a temporary decision. She set the folder on the table. I simply needed someone to give me a reason to stop being quiet. Clara looked at the folder. She looked at Margaret Holt. Mrs. Holt, she said, I don't know how to— Don't thank me yet, Margaret said. Thank me when it's done. She paused. I knew your father. Not well. He came through Durango a few times before you were born, I think. He was a decent man, the kind of decent that's in the grain of a person, not something they put on for company. She looked at Clara with the direct, appraising gaze of a woman who says what she sees. You're like him. I can see it. Clara's composure iron as always bent at the edges. She pressed her lips together, looked down, gave herself exactly 3 seconds. Then she looked up. Then help me finish what he started, she said. That's what I just said I'd do, Margaret said in the tone of a woman who does not need to be asked twice. She picked up her coffee. Now, tell me everything about what Beaumont has filed so far. I want to know exactly what we're working with. They stayed 4 hours. By the time they rode back north, they had Margaret's folder, a signed statement of her willingness to testify, and something Nathan had not expected: a name. A land office clerk in Silver Creek, a man named Porter, who had processed Beaumont's filing on the false debt document. Margaret had seen Beaumont pay Porter 3 years ago for an unrelated facilitation and had written it down. Porter was still working at the same office. He's a loose thread, Clara said on the ride back. Her voice had the controlled energy of someone assembling pieces. If Alderman can get to Porter before Beaumont does. I'll wire Alderman tonight, Nathan said, from the station in Ridgeway. Nathan! Her voice shifted. He glanced over. She was looking at him with the full, direct, unguarded one she didn't let people see often. You rode 8 hours south with me today to talk to a woman you'd never met about a legal case you didn't ask to be part of. Yes, he said. Why? She said, not rhetorically. The real question, the same one she'd asked on the Wagon road that night with her hand on the bench between them, needing the real answer. You know why, he said. I want to hear you say it, Clara said. Quiet. Steady. The voice of a woman who has been told too many things that turned out not to be true and needs the words said plainly. He looked at the road ahead. He looked at the mountains. He looked at the sky above them, which was going blue-gray with late afternoon and the first cold stars beginning to appear. He said, because I'm in love with you. I think I have been since the morning I found you'd fixed the root cellar hinge without telling me. I'm not certain what to do about it at a pace that's right for you, but I'm not uncertain about the fact of it. The horses moved. The sky went darker. Clara said nothing for a long time. Then she said, the hinge. He almost laughed. The hinge. Not the wagon, she said. Not the dinner with Beaumont. Not last night in the house. The hinge, he said firmly. Something about the hinge. She was quiet again. I'm not good at this, she said eventually. At letting someone. She stopped. I've spent a long time being told that what I am is not quite right. Too much of this, not enough of that. Too large, too stubborn, too— She stopped again. I know that's not what you think. I know that. But I'm still— She exhaled. I'm still working on believing the new information. Take all the time you need, Nathan said. I told you I'm patient. You told me you were working on it, Clara said. I'm working very hard on it, he amended. She laughed. It was the first real laugh he'd heard from her, full and genuine and unguarded, rising up out of nowhere and gone just as quickly, leaving behind it a warmth in the air between them that the cold October wind could not touch. Nathan thought, there it is. He filed that sound away very carefully. He intended to hear it again. They reached the wire station at Ridgeway just before it closed, and Nathan sent the telegram to Alderman. 3 sentences, precise and specific. Beaumont using Croft for delay tactics. Margaret Holt, willing to testify, see her records. Approach Porter at land office before Beaumont does. He paid the station master and walked back out to where Clara was waiting with the horses. Done, he said. Now we wait, she said. Now we go home, he said. She looked at him. The word sat between them again, home, easy and solid and exactly right. She gathered her reins. They rode north. It was a week later when Beaumont made his next move, and it was not the legal counter-challenge Nathan had expected. It was Gerald Pitt arriving at the farm on a cold November morning, with two men Nathan had never seen, and a folded document, and the smile of a man who has been told to deliver bad news and has decided to enjoy it. "Mr. Cole," Pitt said from the yard. He did not dismount. "I have here a territorial court order filed under the authority of Judge Harlan Bridges of the Colorado Territorial Court, requiring the return of certain documents illegally removed from the Beaumont property by one Clara Whitmore." He held up the document. "The court requires the documents be surrendered within 48 hours. Nathan came off the porch. He stopped at the yard gate. He looked at Pitt. "Judge Bridges," he said. "Beaumont's brother-in-law." Pitt's smile tightened. "The judge has jurisdiction." "Show me the document," Nathan said. Pitt looked at him. Then he walked his horse to the gate and handed it over. Nathan read it. He read it twice. He was not a lawyer, but he was a man who read carefully and did not pretend to understand things he didn't, and he also did not pretend to miss the things he did. "This order," Nathan said, "references documents taken from the Beaumont property. The documents in question were taken from the Whitmore property." He looked up. "The court order is built on the factual claim that the Whitmore property is Beaumont's property, which is the matter currently in dispute, which means this order is anticipating a legal conclusion that has not yet been reached." Pitt stared at him. "I'll be forwarding this to Mr. Alderman in Denver," Nathan said, and handed the document back. "I'd recommend you tell Beaumont that Judge Bridges is going to want to be careful about preemptive rulings in a case that's currently generating witnesses faster than Beaumont can count." He said it conversationally, not as a threat, just as information. Clara appeared at the door behind him. She looked at Pitt. She looked at the two men with him. She looked at Nathan's back, broad and immovable, at the yard gate. "Good morning, Mr. Pitt," she said pleasantly. "Cold for a ride?" Pitt looked at her. Something in his face, a flicker of something he was not going to name. He'd been the one to deliver the false document to her after her father died. He'd looked at her then with the smug condescension of a man who knows the game is already won. He was looking at her now with something that was no longer smug, something that was working very hard to stay composed. "Miss Whitmore," he said stiffly. "Mrs. Cole," she said. She said it without hesitation, without theater, simply as a correction. Nathan did not turn around, but she saw his shoulders change the smallest shift, the particular adjustment of a man absorbing something that has landed exactly where it was meant to land. Pitt folded the document back into his coat. He looked at Nathan. "This isn't finished," he said. "People keep saying that," Nathan said, "and they keep being right, and then we keep going." Pitt wheeled his horse. The two men followed. They rode down the mountain road and out of sight. Nathan turned around. Clara was standing in the doorway with her arms folded and her chin lifted and her eyes bright, and she looked at him across the yard with the expression of a woman who has just said a thing she meant entirely and is waiting to see if it lands the way she intended. He walked back across the yard. He stopped at the foot of the porch steps. He looked up at her. "Mrs. Cole," he said. "I thought it was the clearest way to make the point," she said. Her voice was entirely composed, but her hands folded under her elbows were gripping her own arms with a pressure that told him something different. "It was the clearest way," he agreed. He looked at her for a moment. "Is that all it was?" Clara held his gaze. The morning was cold and still around them. The horses in the corral were blowing soft clouds of breath. Somewhere in the barn, Bess made a quiet sound. "No," Clara said, barely above a breath. Just that word. Simple and and irrevocable. Nathan went up the steps. He stopped one step below her, so they were level eye to eye, and he looked at her the way he'd been looking at her for weeks, the full, honest look of a man who is not going to pretend he doesn't see what he sees. "Tell me what you need," he said, "to believe the new information." Clara looked at him for a long time. "Just this," she said. "Just—" She stopped, pressed her lips together, started again. "Just keep showing up, that's all. Just keep—" "Clara," he said. "What?" "I'm not going anywhere," he said. She held his gaze. He saw the exact moment she believed him. It was not dramatic. It was very small, the particular softening of a face that has been holding itself together for a very long time and has finally carefully allowed itself to stop. The easing of something she'd been bracing against so long she'd stopped noticing the effort. She reached out and took his hand. Not reaching for it, not grasping, just taking it. The simple, self-possessed gesture of a woman who has decided to accept something good without apology. Nathan closed his fingers around hers. They stood on the porch steps in the cold November morning holding on. Behind them, the house was warm. Below them, the mountain road was empty. And somewhere down that road, Charles Beaumont was beginning to understand the true dimensions of what he was up against. Not just a woman with documents, not just a stubborn rancher, but two people who had found each other in the wreckage of difficult lives and had decided each of them separately and then together that they were not done. That was the whole of it. That was everything. The telegram from Alderman arrived on a Thursday morning in late November, delivered by the same boy Harlan Goss, used for messages, who rode up the mountain in the kind of cold that made his breath come out in long white plumes, and his horse move with the stiff-legged urgency of an animal that wants to be back in a warm barn. Nathan read it at the door. Then he read it again. Then he walked into the kitchen where Clara was mending one of his shirts with the focused, slightly frowning attention she brought to anything she was doing with her hands, and he set the telegram on the table in front of her without a word. She read it. Her hands went still. She read it again. "Porter talked," she said. "Porter talked," Nathan confirmed. The land office clerk. The loose thread. Margaret Holt had identified the man who had processed Beaumont's fraudulent filing for a payment made 3 years ago, and then spent 3 years, hoping nobody would pull that particular thread, had apparently decided upon being approached quietly by Alderman's associate, that his continued employment and liberty were worth more than his loyalty to a man who had never shown him any particular loyalty in return. He had made a statement. A full one. He had named the date, the amount, and the specific instruction he had received from Gerald Pitt on Beaumont's behalf. Pitt's name on a sworn statement changed everything, because Pitt was not Charles Beaumont. Pitt did not have Beaumont's resources, or Beaumont's lawyer, or Beaumont's long practice of making himself untouchable. Pitt was a man who did other men's errands, and had never seriously considered that one of those errands might one day come back to him in a legal proceeding with his name on it. "Alderman says Pitt will fold," Clara said. She was still looking at the telegram, her voice very steady in the way it got when she was processing something large. "He says once Pitt understands the criminal exposure." "Forgery is a serious charge," Nathan said. "Even in a territorial court with a bought judge." "Even with Croft," Clara said. "Even with Croft." She set the telegram down. She pressed both palms flat on the table. She looked at her own hands for a moment. The practical, capable hands of a woman who had fixed hinges and mended tack and sorted 30 years of her father's correspondence in lamplight and worked frozen soil and done every difficult thing that had been required of her without flinching. "It's not over," she said. "No," Nathan agreed. "But it's different now. Porter's statement plus Margaret's testimony plus your father's documents. Croft can delay, but he can't make all of that disappear. There's too much of it." Clara looked up. "Beaumont will go after Porter. He'll try to discredit him, intimidate him, find something to use against him." "Alderman is moving Porter to Denver," Nathan said. He anticipated that. Something moved through Clara's face. "Alderman is better than I thought." "You picked him," Nathan said. "I wrote 3 letters," she said. "The other 2 didn't write back." "You picked him," Nathan repeated. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she stood up, folded the telegram, and put it in the pocket of her apron. "I need to write to my mother," she said. "She needs to know before she hears it from anyone else." "There's paper in the desk," Nathan said. She nodded. She started toward the other room. Then she stopped in the doorway and turned back. "Nathan," she said. He looked at her. She stood there for a moment, framed in the doorway of his kitchen in the house that had been empty for 4 years, in the apron she'd found on the hook the first night with the telegram from a Denver lawyer folded in her pocket, and the whole long, grinding, necessary machinery of justice beginning to turn in the right direction. She said, "Thank you. Not for the telegram. Not for alderman or porter or any of the specific things. Just thank you. The whole of it. Every morning. Every decision. Every mile. Nathan nodded once. She went to write her mother. He stayed in the kitchen and looked at the window and felt the particular quality of that moment, the specific texture of being in a life that had, without his full awareness of the process, become something he did not want to be without. I was still thinking about it when Clara called from the other room. How do I tell her without making her cry before she gets to the good part? Start with the good part, Nathan called back. A pause. That's surprisingly sound advice, Clara said. I have occasional moments, he said. He heard the scratch of pen on paper. He put the kettle on. December came in hard. The way Colorado. Decembers come, not gradually, not with warning, but as a declaration. The mountain road became difficult by the second week and impassable to wagons by the third. They were not snowed in. Nathan had seen real snow and had planned against it with the automatic competence of a man who understood what isolation at altitude actually meant. But they were reduced to the farm and each other and the particular compressed world of two people and a set of animals and a house that was warm because they kept it warm. It was, Nathan thought, the best December he had remembered in a very long time. Not because it was easy. It wasn't easy. The work of a mountain farm in winter was relentless and physical and cold, and there were days when the wind came off the peaks with a malice that made even the horses reluctant, and the water in the barn trough froze overnight and had to be broken every morning, and the endless small repairs and provisions and calculations of survival in altitude occupied both of them from first light to dark. But it was good. It was good in the fundamental, unglamorous, entirely reliable way that things are good when they're real. Clara argued with him about the best way to store the root vegetables, and turned out to be right. He showed her how he read the sky for incoming weather, and she absorbed it with the quick, thorough attention she brought to everything useful, and 2 weeks later was reading it herself and telling him when to bring the horses in early. She read in the evenings whatever she could find on his shelf, and occasionally read passages aloud that she found interesting or funny or moving, not asking him to respond, but simply sharing them the way people share things with other people they want in their world. He told her more about Ruth. Not all at once, gradually, in the way that things come out when two people spend long winter evenings together, and the silence becomes a space where honest things can breathe. Clara listened the way she did everything fully, without rushing him, without performing sympathy, just genuinely present in the way of someone who understands that listening is a form of respect. She told him more about her father, about the specific quality of his patience, the way he'd taught her to read a contract before she could read a novel, the way he'd told her that the most important thing a person could know was the difference between what something was and what someone was telling them it was. He taught you to fight, Nathan said one evening. He taught me to see clearly, Clara said. The fighting was my own contribution. The letter from her mother arrived just before Christmas, carried up by a rider from Durango, who made the trip monthly for the scattered mountain properties. It was long, 8 pages in a small, careful hand, and Clara read it at the kitchen table, with the focused stillness of a woman reading something that requires all of her. When she finished, she folded it very carefully and held it in both hands. Nathan waited. She's well, Clara said. She's staying with Aunt Lorraine in Pueblo. She says Aunt Lorraine's been feeding her too much, and she's been sleeping better than she has in 2 years. A pause. She says she knew all along it would come right. She says my father always said that the truth doesn't expire. You can put it in a floorboard and come back for it 20 years later, and it's still the truth. Nathan was quiet for a moment. She's right, he said. She says she'd like to meet you, Clara said. She looked up. Her eyes were bright. She says anyone who helped her daughter keep the land deserves at least a good meal and a formal introduction. A formal introduction, Nathan said. My mother is a woman of standards, Clara said. Don't take it personally. Should I be nervous? Clara looked at him with the particular sideways look of a woman who is deciding how honest to be, and then decides to be entirely honest. Yes, she said. But you'll manage. He almost laughed. He was doing that more lately. She had that effect not because she tried to, but because she was the kind of person whose company made the world seem against all odds, frequently absurd, in a way that was almost enjoyable. The second telegram, from Alderman, arrived in January, brought up on horseback through a break in the weather. Nathan was in the barn when Clara brought it to him. He knew from her face before she handed it over that it was significant. She had the look she got when she was holding something large in very careful hands. He read it. Gerald Pitt had accepted a plea agreement in exchange for full cooperation and a complete sworn statement detailing Charles Beaumont's instructions and payments related to the fraudulent debt document. The forgery charge against Pitt would be reduced. The statement named Beaumont directly. It named the amount paid. It named the date and the purpose and the specific property targeted. It was Alderman wrote in his careful lawyer's hand, the most complete single piece of evidence in the case. Beaumont Alderman wrote had been informed. "It's done," Clara said quietly. "I mean, the court isn't done, the official ruling isn't done. But the foundation is done. Croft can't build a case on nothing, and now he has nothing." "Beaumont will try to settle," Nathan said. "Let him," Clara said. "Let him try." She said it with a quiet, absolute finality that was not anger. Anger had burned out in her a long time ago, replaced by something colder and more durable. Purpose. The specific, undeflectable purpose of a woman who decided a long time ago what she was fighting for and has not once reconsidered. Nathan looked at her. "Your father's land comes back," he said. "When the ruling comes through, it comes back to you. What do you do with it?" Clara looked at him steadily. "I was going to ask you the same question," she said. "You have a farm on this mountain. I have 20 acres on the valley floor. Those are two separate properties." She paused. "They don't have to be." The barn was very quiet. One of the horses shifted in its stall. Bess made a small sound. "That's a practical observation," Nathan said. "I'm a practical woman," Clara said. "You're also the woman who called herself Mrs. Cole on her front porch in November," Nathan said. "In front of witnesses. I've been waiting to see what you were going to do with that." Clara held his gaze. "I was waiting to see what you were going to do with it," she said. He looked at her for a long moment, at this woman who had thrown herself into his wagon with nothing left, and who had in the months since rebuilt herself on his mountain with the methodical, undefeatable competence of someone who knows exactly who she is, who had fixed his hinges and rearranged his shelves, and read to him in the evenings, and learned to read his sky, and listen to him talk about Ruth, with the grace of someone who understands that loving a person doesn't mean replacing what they lost, who had ridden 8 hours to Durango and faced Charles Beaumont across a dinner table and stood in her father's house in the dark, holding a leather folder against her chest, like it was the last solid thing in the world, and it had been, until she wasn't alone anymore. "I'm not doing anything with it," Nathan said, "except asking you to make it true." Clara went very still. "Nathan Cole," she said. Her voice was soft, completely steady. "Are you asking me to marry you in a barn in January?" "The barn seemed appropriate," he said, "given how we started." She stared at him. Then she laughed. The real one. The full, unguarded laugh he'd first heard on the road to Ridgeway and had been filing away ever since. It came out of her like something released warm and absolute in the cold air of the barn, and Bess turned her head to look at them with the mild curiosity of a horse who has long since decided these two humans are her specific concern. "Yes," Clara said when the laugh had settled. Just that. No conditions, no qualifications. Just the words said with the same self-possessed directness with which she said everything that mattered. "Yes," Nathan said back as if confirming it, as if it needed confirming. Maybe it did. Maybe some things needed to be said twice out loud in the presence of a witness, even if the only witness was a mayor who had decided to trust a woman on no prior evidence except her own judgment. Nathan reached out. He straightened a strand of her hair that the barn wind had blown across her face, a small, unpracticed gesture, the gesture of a man who has not allowed himself to touch someone gently in a long time and is remembering how. Clara stood still under his hand. She looked at him. "I'm going to rearrange your kitchen shelves again in the spring," she said. "I know, he said. "And I'm going to argue with you about the fence line on the north pasture." "You'll probably be right," he said. "I will be," she agreed. "I just want you to be prepared." He took her face in both hands. He kissed her. Not dramatically. Not with the explosive relief of a long-delayed thing finally happening. Just warmly, thoroughly, the way he did the things that mattered to him, with full attention and no reservation, and without any intention of stopping. When he pulled back, Clara looked at him with the expression he would come to know as the one that meant she was choosing not to say something, because the something was too large for words, and she was wise enough to know it. He understood that. He felt the same way. They were married on the 15th of March, 1890, in the small church in Silver Creek, on a morning that was cold, but showed the first clear promise of a Colorado spring. The kind of morning that reminds a person. The hard part is not permanent, that the season always turns, that what has been frozen eventually opens. The church was full. Not out of social obligation, not the performative attendance of a town that shows up for events and whispers against them afterward, but the genuine, uncomplicated presence of people who meant it. Harlan Goss sat in the second row. August Meyer sat beside him. Margaret Holt had ridden up from Durango with 3 of her boarders who hadn't wanted to miss it. James Alderman, who had ridden out from Denver for the occasion, sat near the back with his leather case and the quiet satisfaction of a man who had helped accomplish something worth accomplishing. And in the front row on the bride's side sat a woman of 60, with white hair and a straight back, and the kind of face that contains every version of a person it has ever loved, Clara's mother, who had arrived from Pueblo 4 days earlier on the stage, and had spent those 4 days looking very carefully at everything in the specific manner of a woman conducting a thorough assessment, and had said to Nathan on the 3rd evening in the kitchen while Clara was outside with the horses, "She smiled at breakfast this morning." Nathan had looked at her. "She hasn't smiled at breakfast in 2 years, her mother said. She looked at him with eyes that were exactly her daughter's, the same particular quality in them, that recognition of essential character. That's all I needed to know. She had not said anything else. She hadn't needed to. Clara walked down the aisle of the Silver Creek Church in a dress she had made herself, cream-colored wool fitted through the shoulders, falling full to the floor, altered and re-altered over the cold winter months until it was exactly right. Not a borrowed dress, not a compromised dress. A dress built for her body, as it was by her own hands, to fit the life she had chosen. She was large, and she was beautiful, and she walked with the unhurried, complete self-possession of a woman who has stopped apologizing for the space she takes up in the world. The people of Silver Creek watched her walk. Some of them remembered the things they'd said and thought, and allowed to be said and thought about Clara Whitmore over the years. The sideways looks, the small cruelties that don't announce themselves as cruelty. The comfortable assumption that a woman's body was a legitimate subject for public assessment, and that a woman who did not meet the preferred specification was somehow less. Some of them felt the particular discomfort of that memory. Some of them did not. But all of them watched her walk, and there was not a person in that church who did not understand that what they were seeing was not a woman who had been rescued. It was a woman who had rescued herself and had chosen freely from a position of strength to share her life with a man who had been wise enough to see her clearly from the beginning. Nathan stood at the front of the church and watched her come toward him. I thought about a lot of things in that moment about Ruth, whose presence he felt not as grief, but as something softer, a kind of permission, the blessing of one good life on another. About Daniel, who would have liked Clara immediately, and with enormous enthusiasm, and probably would have been annoying about it. About a cold October day in Silver Creek, and a sound behind a canvas tarp, and 4 seconds in which he had made the best decision of his life. He thought about the root cellar hinge. He almost smiled. Clara reached the front of the church. She stood beside him. She looked at him with the unguarded look, the full one, the one she'd been slowly allowing to become permanent. The minister began. They said the words, the old words worn smooth by repetition, which are still true, the way old true things are true, not despite their simplicity, but because of it. And Nathan Cole put a ring on the finger of Clara Whitmore, and she put one on his, and they looked at each other in the plain morning light of a Colorado church, surrounded by the people who had chosen to show up, and neither of them looked away. The hearing came 6 weeks later. Charles Beaumont did not attend. He sent Croft, who presented the strongest case the documents allowed, which was no longer very strong. Pitt's sworn statement. Margaret Holt's testimony, delivered with the composed, relentless precision of a woman who had been waiting 14 years to say it. Porter's account of the specific transaction. The judge who presided, a man from Denver, who had no relationship with Beaumont and no interest in his standing, listened to all of it with the patience of someone who knows before the end what the outcome will be. He ruled for Clara, the Whitmore land, all 20 acres, the creek boundary, the good south-facing soil, the wild columbines that came up every spring without being asked was restored to the Whitmore family. The fraudulent debt instrument was struck from the record. Gerald Pitt, pursuant to his plea, received a suspended sentence and a permanent mark on his record that would follow him for the rest of his working life. A separate inquiry into Beaumont's other land acquisitions was opened by the territorial government, which had been made aware through channels that aldermen had navigated with quiet competence of a pattern that went well beyond Clara's family. Beaumont did not come to Silver Creek again. His house outside of town was sold within the year. Whatever he did afterward, he did it somewhere else in someone else's county, and if he did it the same way, he had always done it. He did it knowing for the first time in his life that the ground could shift under him, the way it had shifted under the people he'd spent decades shifting it under. The knowing did not make him good, but it made him careful, and sometimes careful is the best you can ask of a bad man. Clara stood outside the courthouse on this day of the ruling. With the verdict in her hand, a single-page official stamped irrevocable, and she looked at it for a long time. Nathan stood beside her. "Your father was right," Nathan said. "The truth doesn't expire." Clara looked at the paper. She pressed it once against her chest, the same gesture she'd made with the leather folder in her father's house in the dark. A private moment with a man who was gone. A brief conversation with someone who wasn't there to hear the answer. Then she folded it. She put it in her pocket. She looked at Nathan. "Take me home," she said. They rode back to the mountain together in the April light, through a valley that was finally fully turning the aspens, just beginning to leaf the creek, running high with snowmelt, the air carrying the specific promise of a Colorado spring that has earned itself after a hard winter. The farm came into view through the trees the way it always did, modest and solid and exactly sufficient. The horses visible in the corral, the kitchen garden on the south side of the house, already showing the first green suggestions of what Clara had planted before the ground froze. She had known where the soil was. She had known how to work it. She dismounted at the gate. She tied her horse. She stood for a moment, looking at the house, not the way she'd looked at it the first night, assessing it as a stranger with a careful eye, but the way you look at something that is entirely unreservedly yours. Nathan came to stand beside her. They stood there together, the way they stood now, easily without performance, as people stand when they are simply where they're supposed to be. "We should start on that north fence this week," Clara said, "before the ground gets too soft." "I thought you were going to argue with me about the fence line," Nathan said. "I am," she said, "while we're fixing it." He looked at her. She looked at him. And the thing that moved between them in that moment was not romantic, in the grand performed sense, not flowers and declarations, and the kind of love that exists primarily to be witnessed. It was the other kind, the real kind, the one that shows up before dawn, and fixes hinges and argues about fence lines, and reads aloud in the evenings, and says, "Take me home," and means it, and goes to sleep in a house that is warm because they made it warm together. Clara Whitmore had not needed a man to rescue her. She had needed a world that would finally honestly see her, and she had built that world herself, document by document, decision by decision, one honest mile at a time. Nathan Cole had not needed saving from his solitude. He had needed a reason worth coming inside for. They had found each other in the only way that lasts. Not by accident, not by rescue, but by two people deciding separately, and then together, that what they had was worth every difficult thing it had cost to get here. They walked inside. The door closed behind them. The house was home.